The clock had just struck 8:30 p.m. when an FBI agent was wrapping up his day at the Detroit field office. Snow was starting to drift down from the dark winter sky, adding to the peaceful quiet of the evening. He'd spent the last 12 hours coordinating with his team on a complex case, and the weight of the day sat heavy on his shoulders. As he gathered his things, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the office window. Tired eyes and slightly messy dark hair told the story of the long day. His colleagues had left hours ago, but being thorough with case files was something he never compromised on. The coffee in his travel mug had gone cold hours ago, forgotten during an intense conference call with the Washington office. The parking garage was nearly empty when he headed to his car, his footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. His unmarked government vehicle, a modest dark sedan, sat in its usual spot. It was clean but unremarkable, exactly what you'd want for someone in his position. The engine purred to life, and the heating system slowly began to warm the cold interior. As he pulled out onto the main road, his mind wandered to the simple pleasures waiting at home. A warm dinner, maybe catch up on that new crime documentary everyone at the office had been talking about. The streetlights cast long shadows through the falling snow, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere. He adjusted the radio to a low volume, letting the soft jazz help him transition from work mode to evening relaxation. The roads were quieter than usual, probably due to the weather. Small businesses along the route were closing up for the night, their signs going dark one by one. He noticed a new coffee shop had opened on the corner. Mental note to try it sometime. The familiar route home was something he could practically drive with his eyes closed, though of course he never would. Every turn, every traffic light, was part of his daily routine. Little did he know, this ordinary drive home was about to become anything but routine. The burnt-out taillight on his car was silently setting the stage for what would become one of the most memorable evenings of his career. He drove past the city limits sign, where the streetlights became more sparse, and the snowfall seemed to thicken in his headlights. His phone buzzed with a message, probably his brother asking about their weekend plans. It sat untouched in his jacket pocket. After years in law enforcement, good driving habits were second nature. The dashboard clock showed 8:45 p.m. as he turned onto the highway that would take him home. Just 15 more minutes, he thought, already imagining changing into comfortable clothes. The heat was finally working properly now, creating a cozy bubble inside the car. He loosened his tie slightly, the first step in unwinding from the day. Through his rearview mirror, the city lights were growing distant, twinkling like stars through the gentle snowfall. The road ahead was clear, with just a few other cars sharing the highway. That's when everything changed. In that same rearview mirror, a new set of lights appeared, red and blue, cutting through the peaceful winter evening like a knife. His heart didn't race. Years of training had taught him to stay calm in unexpected situations. But as he carefully signaled and pulled over to the shoulder, he knew this would be an interaction unlike any other. The police lights painted the falling snow in alternating flashes of red and blue. The FBI agent smoothly guided his sedan onto the shoulder of the highway, making sure to pull far enough over to give the officer a safe approach. His mind quickly ran through standard protocol. He'd been on both sides of this situation during his career. He kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, clearly visible. Through his side mirror, he could see the police officer emerging from their patrol car. The beam of a flashlight swept across his rear window, catching the snowflakes in its path. The crunch of boots on snow grew louder as the officer approached. Years of training kicked in. The agent knew this next part would be delicate. He had his badge and ID ready, but reaching for them too quickly could make things tense. He'd heard plenty of stories from fellow agents about similar situations. Some went smoothly, others, not so much. The tap on his window was firm and professional. As he pressed the button to lower it, the cold winter air rushed in, bringing with it that distinctive mix of exhaust fumes and fresh snow. The officer stood slightly behind the doorframe, following their training to maintain a safe position. "Good evening, sir. "I'm Officer White with the local police department," came the steady voice. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" The agent kept his voice calm and steady. "Good evening, officer. Before we continue, I need to inform you that I'm a federal agent, and I'm armed." He noticed the officer's posture shift slightly. This was a crucial moment. "I'm going to keep my hands visible, and I'd like to slowly reach for my credentials." The snow was falling harder now, the flakes catching in the beam of the officer's flashlight. In the distance, another set of blue and red lights appeared. Backup arriving, standard procedure when dealing with an armed individual. The situation was about to get more complicated. "Proceed slowly," the officer instructed, their hand naturally moving closer to their weapon. The agent moved with deliberate care, reaching for his credentials with smooth, telegraphed movements. The sound of a second patrol car pulling up behind them added to the tension in the air. Time seemed to slow down. Other cars passed by on the highway, their headlights creating long shadows that danced across the scene. The agent could hear the crackle of the police radio, the murmur of codes and numbers being exchanged. He'd used those same codes countless times, but being on this side of the exchange was different. The second officer took up a position on the passenger side of the vehicle, their presence reflected in the agent's side mirrors. It was a textbook approach to a high-risk stop, even though this one had started as a simple traffic violation. The agent appreciated their thoroughness. It was exactly what he would have done in their position. Through his rearview mirror, he could see the first officer radioing in his credentials. The verification process would take time. More cars whizzed past, their drivers probably wondering what was happening in this little tableau of law enforcement interaction. The heating system in his car continued to run, creating a small haven of warmth against the winter night. The whole situation was a study in professional courtesy and procedure. Every movement, every word had to be carefully chosen. One wrong move or misunderstanding could turn this routine stop into something much more serious. But there was something else building here too, a strange sort of respect between professionals, even as they worked to verify each other's identities and intentions. Little did any of them know that this snowy evening was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would transform this seemingly routine traffic stop into something none of them would ever forget. The FBI agent sat patiently as the verification process unfolded. His credentials lay carefully displayed on the dashboard, catching occasional glints from the emergency lights. The scene had drawn the attention of passing drivers, their faces briefly visible as they slowed down to peek at what was happening. "Dispatch, run that badge number again." The officer's voice carried through the cold air. The agent could hear the slight edge of uncertainty in their tone. It wasn't every day that local police encountered a federal agent during a routine traffic stop. He remembered being on the other side of similar situations, the importance of double-checking everything, leaving nothing to chance. The snow was accumulating on his windshield now, creating a soft blanket that muffled the harsh glare of the police spotlights. Through his mirrors, he could see the two officers conferring behind his vehicle, their breath visible in the cold night air. They were doing everything by the book, exactly as they should. Suddenly, the agent's phone buzzed again in his pocket. Under normal circumstances, he might have checked it, but right now, any unexpected movement could complicate things. He thought about all the training scenarios he'd run through at Quantico, but somehow being on this side of things felt different. The vulnerability of sitting in a stopped car, surrounded by officers who were just doing their job, brought a new perspective to his years of experience. The first officer approached again, this time with a slightly different energy. "Sir, we're just waiting on final verification from the FBI office. I apologize for the delay, but I'm sure you understand the protocol." The agent nodded, appreciating the professional courtesy. "Of course, officer. Take all the time you need. Safety first." A gust of wind swept across the highway, swirling snow around the vehicles. The agent noticed how the officer maintained perfect positioning despite the weather, good training showing through. In the distance, the city lights glowed softly through the snowfall, creating an almost peaceful backdrop to this tense situation. The radio crackled to life again. The agent could tell from the change in the officers' postures that something interesting had come through. He watched in his mirrors as they huddled closer together, their conversation just out of earshot. Years of reading body language told him something unexpected had come up during the verification process. The backup officer moved to maintain their position, while the primary officer approached the car once more. This time, their approach was different, less tense, more curious. The agent had seen this shift before in his own work, the moment when a routine situation suddenly becomes something more interesting. "Sir," the officer began, shining the flashlight at a respectful angle, "we've confirmed your credentials with the Bureau." There was a pause, the kind that usually preceded something unexpected. "But there's something else that's come to our attention. When we ran your vehicle registration, it flagged something in our system." The agent's mind quickly ran through possibilities. His car was a standard Bureau vehicle, nothing special about it. But in law enforcement, sometimes the most routine situations could reveal surprising connections. He waited, knowing that whatever came next would change the entire dynamic of this snowy evening encounter. Through the windshield, he could see more snowflakes dancing in the emergency lights, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. The moment hung there, suspended in the winter night, as he waited to hear what the database search had revealed. Sometimes the smallest coincidences could lead to the most extraordinary discoveries. The officer took a deep breath before continuing, their flashlight beamed steady in the snowy night. "Sir, this vehicle was logged as part of a task force operation 2 years ago. A big case involving missing children." The officer's voice had changed, carrying a note of recognition and something more personal. The agent leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. That case, he remembered it clearly. 6 months of intensive work, sleepless nights, and finally, a breakthrough that led to the rescue of 12 children. But why would this officer be particularly interested in that case? "That operation," the officer continued, their professional demeanor softening slightly, "it made a difference to a lot of families around here." They paused, seeming to choose their next words carefully. "Including mine." The snowfall had intensified, creating a private atmosphere around their conversation. The backup officer remained at their post, but even their stance had changed, picking up on the shift in energy. The agent waited, knowing there was more to this story. "My niece was one of the kids you found," the officer said quietly. "She was just 10 years old. We'd almost given up hope." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The agent felt his throat tighten. He remembered every face from that case, every family reunion, every tear of relief. The memory of that operation flooded back. The countless hours of surveillance, the careful building of evidence, the final raids that brought those children home. Each success had been a team effort, involving dozens of law enforcement officers from various agencies. And now, by pure chance, he was face to face with someone whose life had been touched by that work. "She's doing great now," the officer added, pride evident in their voice. "Back in school, playing soccer. It's like she got her childhood back." The beam of the flashlight lowered slightly, no longer needed for official purposes. This had become a different kind of conversation. The agent thought carefully before responding. In his years of service, moments like these were rare. Seeing the long-term impact of their work, meeting the families whose lives they'd helped piece back together. "I'm glad to hear that," he said simply, knowing no other words were really necessary. Through his rearview mirror, he could see the backup officer step closer, drawn in by the conversation. They too had probably heard about that case. It had made headlines across the state. The successful rescue of so many children had been a bright spot in an often difficult job. The first officer cleared their throat, professionally pulling the moment back to the present. "About that taillight, though, you'll want to get that fixed." There was a hint of a smile in their voice now. "Can't have a federal agent driving around with faulty equipment, can we?" The tension that had filled the air earlier had completely transformed. What had started as a routine traffic stop escalated into a high-alert situation with an armed federal agent, had now become something entirely different, a reminder of why they all chose this line of work in the first place. The sound of passing cars seemed distant now, the swirling snow creating a bubble around this unexpected reunion. Sometimes, the agent realized, the most meaningful moments came disguised as ordinary encounters. Here, on a snowy highway shoulder, two law enforcement officers from different agencies had found a connection that went beyond badges and protocols. The first officer motioned to their partner, who approached the vehicle now with a notably different demeanor. The backup officer had been part of the same local force during that trafficking case, though working in a different district. The snow continued to fall around them, but no one seemed to notice the cold anymore. "I remember when that case broke," the backup officer spoke up. "The whole department was tracking the updates. We had 3 of the missing kids reported in our precinct." They shook their head, remembering. The day you guys made those raids, every officer in the break room was glued to the radio. The FBI agent shifted in his seat, memories of that day rushing back. The pre-dawn briefing, dozens of law enforcement vehicles staging in remote locations, the tense minutes before the coordinated raids began. Every officer, agent, and support staff member knowing that children's lives hung in the balance. "We had no idea the FBI was already working the case," the first officer admitted. "Everyone was working their own angles, trying to find leads." Then suddenly, everything came together. They leaned slightly against the car door. The formality of the traffic stop completely forgotten. "How did you guys finally crack it?" The agent considered his response carefully. Even now, some details couldn't be shared, but there were lessons that could benefit fellow law enforcement officers. It was actually a small detail. A delivery truck that kept showing up in different surveillance photos. Seemed normal at first, but the timing was too perfect. Both officers listened intently. These were the kinds of insights that didn't make it into official reports or news stories. The backup officer pulled their jacket tighter against the cold, but made no move to leave. The learning opportunity was too valuable. "The truck driver had no idea what was really happening," the agent continued. "He was just doing his regular route. But once we tracked the pattern..." He paused, remembering the breakthrough moment. "Well, it led us to the right people." The first officer nodded slowly. "My niece mentioned a truck. In her therapy sessions later, said she could always hear it arriving." Their voice carried the weight of personal connection to the case. "Never knew that's what broke it open." Through the swirling snow, another police car drove past slowly, probably checking if backup was needed. The first officer waved them on. Everything was under control. This scene probably looked strange from the outside. 2 officers having what appeared to be a casual conversation with a stopped driver. "You know," the backup officer said thoughtfully, "we've got some cases now that, well, they've got some similar patterns." They glanced at their partner, then back to the agent. "Any chance we could run some details by your task force?" "Officially, through channels, of course." The agent reached for one of his cards, moving slowly out of habit despite the now relaxed atmosphere. "Our office coordinates with local departments all the time. Sometimes fresh eyes help spot patterns we might miss." He handed the card over carefully. "That's what makes the job work. Everyone bringing their piece of the puzzle." The falling snow had begun to coat the officers' uniforms, creating an almost ethereal scene in the red and blue emergency lights. What had started as a simple traffic stop had evolved into something that could potentially help other investigations, other children. The kind of unexpected connection that reminded them all why they chose this line of work. The conversation shifted as the first officer pulled out a small notebook, their breath visible in the cold night air. "We've got 3 open cases that have been bothering us," they said, flipping through pages of handwritten notes. "Kids from different neighborhoods, but something feels connected." The FBI agent recognized that instinct, the subtle patterns that experienced officers pick up on, even before they can explain why. He'd learned to trust those hunches during his years of service. Sometimes the best breaks in a case started with just a feeling that something wasn't quite right. The most recent one, the backup officer added, stepping closer to shield their conversation from passing traffic, happened last week. The details match some of what we saw in your old case. They glanced at their partner, getting a slight nod of approval to continue. Same age range, similar areas. The agent switched into work mode, his tired thoughts of dinner and relaxation forgotten. Have you noticed any regular vehicles? Delivery trucks, service vans, anything that shows up in the background? He kept his voice low, aware that even on this snowy highway shoulder, some conversations needed privacy. The first officer's eyes widened slightly. There was a cable company van in some of the security footage. Didn't think much of it at first. They're doing upgrades all over town. They quickly jotted something in their notebook. But now that you mention it, a passing truck sprayed snow onto the shoulder, momentarily interrupting their conversation. The backup officer used their flashlight to illuminate the notebook, where times and locations were being quickly noted. This impromptu meeting was turning into an informal task force planning session. Listen, the agent said, reaching for his work phone. I can't officially consult here on the highway. But tomorrow morning, bring what you have to the federal building downtown. He paused, knowing how bureaucracy usually worked. I'll call ahead. Make sure they're expecting you at security. Both officers straightened up slightly. Getting into the federal building usually involved mountains of paperwork and weeks of waiting. The first officer tucked their notebook away carefully, as if it had suddenly become more valuable. We'll bring everything we have. Photos, witness statements, patrol reports. The backup officer spoke up again, their voice carrying a note of hope. Even if it's nothing, having another perspective might help. We can't let. They trailed off, but everyone knew what they meant. They couldn't let another group of kids go through what had happened 2 years ago. The snow had begun to ease up, the flakes now falling lazily around them. Other cars continued to pass by, their drivers unaware that what looked like a routine traffic stop might have just sparked something much more significant. Sometimes the best investigative breakthroughs happened in the most unexpected places. First thing tomorrow morning, the first officer confirmed, checking their watch. We'll be there. They stepped back from the vehicle, resuming a more professional stance. After all, they were still technically in the middle of a traffic stop. And don't forget about that taillight. Wouldn't want to give any other officers a reason to pull you over. The agent smiled slightly, appreciating how they'd come full circle. I'll get it fixed first thing in the morning before our meeting. He started his engine, the heat coming back on to fight against the winter chill. Sometimes a broken taillight leads to exactly where you need to be. The next morning arrived crisp and clear, the previous night's snow gleaming under bright winter sunshine. The FBI agent arrived at the office earlier than usual, making sure to stop at the auto shop first thing to get that taillight fixed. As he walked through security, he couldn't help but smile at how a routine traffic stop had turned into something potentially much bigger. The lobby of the federal building buzzed with its usual morning activity. Security guards checked IDs, workers hurried to their offices clutching coffee cups, and visitors waited patiently in the check-in line. The agent had already called ahead, making sure the two officers would have smooth access when they arrived. Right on time, he spotted them walking through the main entrance. They looked different in the daylight, wearing plain clothes instead of their uniforms, each carrying thick folders under their arms. The first officer carried the same notebook from last night, now accompanied by what looked like several USB drives. "Good morning," the agent greeted them, walking over to the security desk. "These are the officers I called about." The security guard nodded, already briefed about the meeting. As they got their visitor badges, the agent could sense their mixture of nervousness and determination. Many local officers never got to see inside this building. Leading them to a conference room, the agent noticed how they took in everything around them. The busy hallways, the secured doors, the organized chaos of a federal office in full swing. The backup officer whispered something about it being different from what they'd imagined. less like the movies and more like a regular office. "Coffee," the agent offered, pointing to the break room across the hall. Both officers nodded gratefully. As they settled into the conference room, the first officer began laying out photos and reports on the table. Their organization was impressive. Everything labeled, dated, and arranged chronologically. "We were up late going through old case files," the backup officer admitted, pulling out their laptop. "Once we started looking with that delivery truck pattern in mind, other things started jumping out." They opened a digital map marked with various colored pins and notes. The agent leaned forward, instantly recognizing the methodology they'd used. It was similar to how his team had mapped patterns 2 years ago. These officers had good instincts. They just needed the resources and connections to take their investigation to the next level. "Tell me everything from the beginning," the agent said, pulling out his own notebook. "Don't leave anything out, even if it seems small." He remembered how tiny details had broken open the previous case. Sometimes, the smallest observation could be the key to everything. The first officer started talking, pointing to various locations on their map. Their voice carried the same passion he'd heard the night before when they spoke about their niece. But now it was focused, professional, driven by the determination to prevent other families from going through similar ordeals. Sunlight streamed through the conference room windows, highlighting the dust motes in the air as they dove deeper into the case details. What had started as a chance encounter on a snowy highway was transforming into a serious investigation. Sometimes, the agent thought, the best partnerships started in the most unexpected ways. Hours passed in the conference room as maps, photos, and timelines spread across the table. Coffee cups piled up as the group pieced together what started to look like a clear pattern. The first officer's hunch had been right. There was definitely something connecting their recent cases. "Look at this," the backup officer pointed to a series of photographs. The cable van shows up in the background of 3 different locations. They slid another photo across the table. And here's what's interesting. The cable company says they had no scheduled work in those areas on those days. The FBI agent nodded, his mind already racing ahead to next steps. He pulled up some files from the previous case on his laptop. 2 years ago, they used legitimate-looking vehicles too. Made everything seem normal to the neighbors. He turned the screen to show them some old surveillance photos. "See the similarities." The first officer stood up, walking to the window for a moment. They'd been at this for hours now, and the winter sun was already starting to set. "We need to move fast on this," they said, turning back to the group. "If we're right about the pattern," they didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what was at stake. The agent picked up his phone, dialing a familiar number. "Time to bring in the task force," he said, waiting for the call to connect. "You've done great work here. Now let's give it the resources it needs." He watched as both officers straightened in their chairs, realizing their late-night traffic stop was about to transform into a full federal investigation. Within an hour, the conference room filled with more agents and analysts. The local officers' carefully prepared materials were quickly scanned and displayed on large screens. Their observations, initially just hunches and careful notes, were now being transformed into actionable intelligence. "Your instincts were spot on," one of the analysts said, examining the mapped patterns. "The vehicle sightings, the timing, the locations, it all fits the profile." The first officer nodded, thinking about their niece and all the other families still waiting for answers. The backup officer sat quietly for a moment, watching the federal team at work. "You know," they said softly to the agent, "when we pulled you over last night, I never imagined we'd end up here." They gestured at the busy room. Funny how things work out sometimes. As the day drew to a close, plans were already in motion. Surveillance teams were being assembled, warrants were being drafted, and a command center was being set up. The small spark of investigation that had started with a routine traffic stop was now a blazing fire of activity. "We'll need you both on this," the agent told the officers as they prepared to leave. "You know the local area, the community. That's invaluable. He watched as pride and determination crossed their faces. This was why they'd chosen law enforcement, to make a real difference in people's lives. The winter evening had settled outside, the federal building's lights reflecting off the fresh snow. As the group gathered their materials, there was a sense of purpose in the air. Sometimes the biggest cases started with the smallest coincidences, like a burnt-out taillight on a snowy night. 3 weeks later, in the early hours of a cold morning, dozens of law enforcement vehicles gathered quietly in various locations around the city. The FBI agent stood in the command center, surrounded by screens showing different team positions. The 2 officers from that snowy night were there too, now fully integrated into the task force. "All units in position," crackled the radio. The first officer gripped their vest tightly, thinking about their niece and the families who would be affected by today's operation. The backup officer stood ready by the door, no longer just a local cop, but a key member of a federal task force. "On my mark." The agent's voice was steady as he gave the final commands. Months of work by local police had combined with federal resources and experience to lead to this moment. What started with a simple traffic stop had unveiled a network that had been operating right under their noses. The raids happened simultaneously across 7 locations. The cable company van, now known to be a fake, was found abandoned at one site. But more importantly, 5 children were rescued, all of them safe, all of them going home to their families. The people responsible were taken into custody without incident. Later that afternoon, as the processing and paperwork continued, the first officer sat quietly in the break room. The agent brought them a coffee, remembering that snowy night when they'd first shared their suspicions. "You know," the officer said, looking up, "when I pulled you over that night, I was just doing my job. Never thought it would lead to this." The backup officer joined them, still wearing their tactical gear. "5 families get to sleep better tonight," they said, their voice thick with emotion. All because of a burnt-out taillight. They shared a knowing look. Sometimes the smallest things could lead to the biggest changes. News crews had gathered outside the federal building, but the real story wouldn't be in their headlines. It would be in the quiet moments. Children reunited with parents, families made whole again, communities healing. The kind of victories that law enforcement officers carried in their hearts, fueling them through the tough days. The agent watched as his team worked with local officers, sharing information, building stronger connections for future cases. The wall that sometimes existed between federal and local law enforcement had crumbled a bit more, all because of a chance encounter on a winter night. "We've got something else you should look at," the first officer said, pulling out their ever-present notebook. "Different case, different pattern, but—" They paused, sharing a look with their partner. "Well, we thought maybe we could run it by you." The agent smiled, remembering his own early days, learning to trust those instincts that told you something wasn't quite right. "Let's hear it," he said, pulling up a chair. "After all, you never know where these conversations might lead." Outside, the sun was setting on another winter day. Inside, law enforcement officers from different agencies sat together, sharing stories, comparing notes, building the kind of connections that made their difficult job a little easier. And somewhere in the city, families were being reunited, proving that sometimes the most meaningful changes started with the smallest moments. The traffic stop that could have been a simple warning about a taillight had transformed into something much more significant. It had become a reminder of why they all wore the badge. Not for the big headlines or dramatic moments, but for the quiet victories that made all the difference in people's lives.